Good afternoon. We're a couple minutes late. Sent you an email so that you would get the link to tonight's audio and video lecture. The telephone number is, pardon me, the telephone number is also listed in case you want to dial in that way. Uh, Tonight, we're going to discuss things that are pertinent to the first written assignment, not the forum discussion. And by the way, I appreciate that everybody got the forum discussions in as quickly as you did. I have responded to each of you, and I have reopened the time period in case someone wants to provide feedback for anyone who, to my responses, to my feedback, or possibly to respond to another student once again. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the fact that most of you did also respond to others' posts. That helps us learn, and I thought the comments were good and well taken. So we're going to talk about what it is for the first written assignment, which is to be uploaded to the assignments coursework page or coursework assignments page. I think that's the way it's shown. And of course, we have two forum discussions for next week as well. So pardon me, what I ask you to do for the first written assignment is to provide an overview definition. And by the way, it's overview. It's not to be in detail, but it gives some kind of an overview so you can get some of the concepts, you understand them, of recruitment, selection, staffing, and job analysis. Now we're going to discuss, recruitment, selection, and job analysis in greater detail in future weeks. Staffing we'll cover a little bit tonight. I have some additional slides that I will put up here from the Henneman text that I use as an additional resource, addition to the text that you have by Caruth, and Payne. So this assignment is, again, to prepare the overview definition and why each is important to effective human resource management. And I have I think a really good slide when we get to staffing a little bit later on. A very pertinent comment made by an individual who's an executive with a corporation. When providing definitions, they should always be in your words and not those of the text. Now, I realize that there are times that you can't get away from using the text words, or you may want to quote the text, but please, if you do that, make sure you cite that reference correctly. But I would prefer that you put the definitions in your own words. It's known as paraphrasing. Paraphrasing demonstrates two things. One, that you can place the definition in your own words, or if you're doing some review or research or something else, you can place what you found in your own words. And two, that in doing so, you're not losing the original meaning of what the authors of the definition had to say. Prior to beginning a recruitment process to fill vacancies, an organization should engage in two processes, which we're going to talk about extensively here tonight. And I hope that we can make the necessary points for you to really understand and grasp this what we're going to say here. The first is human resource planning, and the second is preparing a job analysis or job analyses, assuming there's more than one vacancy. Well, actually, assuming there's more than one position. If you have a position vacancy, vacancy, pardon me again, and there are 10 people that hold the same job description or have the same job, let's not talk about job description, have the same job title, then there's only one job analysis that's required because each of those people is performing the same task. Now, if you have a group of jobs with similar job titles, but they're all different, then you would need more than one job analysis, hence the term job analyses. You absolutely need more than one. The text, as you should know, pardon me, treats job analysis in Chapter 5, and pardon me, human resource planning in Chapter 6. I won't quibble with the text and don't intend to quibble with the text. The people who are authors of the text are very knowledgeable in this field. But I believe that human resource planning should come before a job analysis. You have to have some concept in your mind. We're going to talk about this in a second, this human resource planning. You should have some kind of idea in your mind of what type of jobs you need, what the company is going to need. This becomes part of the strategic analysis, comes part of the business strategy of an organization, and where the HR folks are actually sitting down with the CEO. And really, large organizations absolutely have a vice president of human resources. That person has a position at the corporate table, and the reason for that is because the company cannot set its mission, goals, and objectives, or change them accordingly without talking to HR and finding out whether or not the surrounding community provides, and we'll talk about this later, provides the skilled workforce that it needs, or provides the workforce with the skills that it needs. Maybe that's a better way of saying that. Note the sentence at the bottom of page 116. Human resource planning is an integral piece of the organization's strategy, and without it, companies won't be successful. Now, what that means, obviously, are two things. Number one, the company has to have a strategy. But number two, the human resource planning must dovetail, must fit into, must complement the strategic plan. It has to be a part of the strategic plan, because if it's not, there's going to be an issue. Ivancovich, John Ivancovich, in his Human Resource Management 9th edition text published in 2004, says that human resource planning is both a process and a set of plans. The planning piece, according to Ivancovich, determines the numbers and types of employees a firm will need. Furthermore, the plan attempts to eliminate any disparity between the labor supply and the ensuing demand. So what that simply means is if you look at the local labor supply and it does not provide what you need, then you're going to have some issues. Hello, somebody join? Hello? All right, we'll continue. The authors of your text, Carruth, and Payne, define human resource planning a little differently. The authors state it may be thought of as one, a forecast of the organization's labor needs that scans the internal environment and the external environment. Remember, the internal environment is one we control. The external environment is one we do not control. Internal shows both an organization's requirements and the assets currently available. There are HRIS programs, human resource information systems, that many large companies and perhaps medium-sized companies as well use to track their current employee inventory. And it should have associated with it a list of that particular employee's skills and education and experience, and a few other type things. Additional training, additional education, things of that nature. The forecast then compares the two to determine if any gaps exist and determine how those should be addressed as necessary. I'm going to put a slide up here to give you some kind of an idea of what we're talking about here. This is human resource planning, a little bit differently maybe than the other two says, but pretty close to what we said. Now this slide I have up here comes from Stewart and Brown, Human Resource Management Linking Strategy to Practice, second edition. I use these slides in the Henneman slides because our text does not have PowerPoint slides associated with it. And this, notice here at the bottom, predicting future needs, planning for internal movement. Now remember, internal movement includes promotion, lateral transfer, termination, unfortunately, and also retirement. There may be a couple other things that are missing, but it should include all of that. And then the last thing is if you can't fill from within, then you have to predict what your external hiring needs are going to be. Now, there's a domino effect here in some respects. Let's assume all things are equal, and you have a vacancy created by a retirement. And so you go through your HRIS system and you select the person or persons to compete for that job. I mean, you may also post it on the company bulletin board and things of that nature. Well, anyway, you select somebody from internally to fill that position. That means that you have, pardon me, that means that you have another vacancy to fill. Now, that vacancy could be filled internally depending upon the level of position we're talking about. If we're talking about a middle manager who may have a supervisor under him or her, and then there are employees underneath the supervisor, moving the supervisor up to management means now you're going to have a replacement for the supervisor, which most likely should come internally. And now we're down here to the people working where the rubber meets the road. That's probably an entry-level position, and so in that case, you're probably going to go out to the external environment and try to find someone to fill that position. So your replacement or replacements can be a combination of both internal assets, using that internal to fill a higher level position, and then an external to fill an entry level, pardon me, an entry level position. For the most part, we find that entry level positions are filled externally. Now, we can say that perhaps in some cases that doesn't happen, but that's not always the case, and we need to stop and think about that in some manner. The second piece is setting policies and procedures in place to acquire the needed human resources. Perhaps you prefer the term employees, that's fine. But the reason I like to tend to continue to use human resources is because employees must be thought of as a resource, and they must be treated as a resource. That means that if we look at resources, for the most part, in this world, most of our resources are not are finite. That means that they're not going to be around forever, and they're not replaceable. Now, yeah, you're going to tell me that employees are replaceable, and that's true. But you have to remember that anytime you replace an employee, a certain amount of expertise and knowledge goes out the door with that employee. That doesn't mean to say the new person that you hired is not a good person. That just means to say there are things that that other person knew that go out the door with him or her at the time of retirement, or transfer to a different position, promoted to a different position, leave the company for some reason. So we have to look at all those things. we can consider this as an action plan, this determination. That is, what do we need? Where can we find the resources? And what do we need to do to attract those potential employees to apply for job vacancies? Now, there I'm talking about, for the most part, people outside the organization. So we've more or less covered the third piece pointed out by the author, so any additional comments would be superfluous. Finally, the authors say there is some commonality in this human resource planning definition, or definitions. First, human resource planning is not a one-time activity. It is continual, and must be to be successful. So that means it's not a process we start once, maybe once a year, and just let it go and don't look at it again until next year. You know, it's a continuing operation, if you will. Second, the primary purpose of human resource planning is to help assure the organization achieves its mission, goals, and objectives. Third, human resource planning cannot be undertaken on a whim. It must be thorough, analytical, and in sync with the organization's strategic initiatives. Figure 6.1 on page 119 depicts the human resource planning process with 3 phases. Note that it begins as a part of strategic business planning. Phase 1 is concerned with numbers. The numbers, as you can see, are a moving target, and they are affected by production, attrition, and, strangely enough, the status quo. Phase 2 is concerned with availability, both internal and external, and we've talked about that to some extent. Phase 3 is the action plan, or the action phase. In this phase, the human resource planners must ensure the organization has the right number of employees in the right jobs and that they are adequately skilled and educated. Now, let's look at this human resource planning slide here from Stewart and Brown. Now, I didn't want to do that. I want to get that down far enough we could read the whole thing. It's a little difficult. So we're going to do this a little bit differently than what the authors have pointed out, but there's a lot of commonality here. We're going to assess our current employee workforce. And then it mentions up there in the first bullet, human resource, information systems. And it's going to help us depict, if you will, the number of employees that we currently have on the books and in the different categories or in the different job classifications. Then we're going to predict future needs. In some cases, this is subjective, although we can use some expert judgments and some statistical models. Then we're going to predict employee movement. Now, that is not as difficult as it may seem. Companies should have, through their human resource information systems, some idea of what type of attrition they have on an annual basis. And of course, that attrition, now I'm only talking about attrition here. I'm not talking about movement, I'm talking about attrition. The attrition here will be made up of retirements, personnel who are terminated, or personnel who leave the organization for other job opportunities. And there is some data that can be gotten from the Department of Labor about traditional turnover percents per industry. I don't have that website information right handy. We'll have it later in the course, but you can go to the Department of Labor and you can ask for that, and that information is available under O asterisk JobNet. I'll get to that information. I'll get you that a little bit more clearly in the future. And then the last part is plan for external hiring. I didn't completely finish predicting employee movement. Then we come to vacancies that will be filled internally. And we should have some kind of an idea of how often we do that, what positions lend themselves best to being filled by an internal candidate or candidates, assuming there's more than one vacancy, excuse me. And then we go to the external hiring. Now, one of the things we have to do in this phase is to look at some of the requirements forecast. I said before, it's an estimate of both quantity and type needed to fill projected vacancies. Now, I glossed over quality, and that is not meant to say to you that quality is not important. Quality is important. But you need to get a quantity, and then you use the quantity that you have, and I'm talking here about applications, then you take the quantity and pare that quantity down to quality. So I want us to remember that forecasting is not an accurate science. It's usually accomplished in one of two ways. Subjective, based on input from the managers or supervisors or both, and quantitative, which is a mathematical based formula, which we kind of addressed a little bit previously. Availability forecast comes in two varieties, internal and external. We always talked about the internal because the human resources information system run by the human resource management folks is going to tell us or have information for us for internal things like education, experience, certification, and licenses held, and then obviously performance appraisals. So it's going to give us some estimate on the internal side. Well, it's not going to give us some estimate. It's going to give us a good estimate, probably a fairly solid estimate of what we have in-house in the current workforce, and then what we can do and how we can get those people to apply, et cetera, et cetera. A separate inventory for managers is maintained. It would contain much of the same information we talked about before, but also the field that that person is in: accounting, engineering, information management, information technology, things of that nature. Job and location preferences, promotion potential, and then finally completion of in-house training and any in-house programs. So this is not two different systems, or it shouldn't be two different systems. It would just be a different category entered for the managers. Then the external, which is where we're going to get most of our entry-level employees. And of course, we will get some higher-level employees from external recruitment as well. We're going to consider much of the information we've already used for internal candidates, and then other important criteria such as demographic changes. Now, here I'm talking about within the operating environment, outside operating environment. Education level is the education level in the current operating environment. What we want is it at least satisfactory? Has it gone down? If it's gone up, it may be good for us, may not be good for us, because if it's gone up, there's going to be more competition. And so we may have to make some other adjustments. What the nature of the economy is. If we have a good economy and we have what economists refer to as full employment, by the way, that's, to me, that's a misnomer, because that does not mean that everybody who wants to work is actually working. Full employment tends to be somewhere around a 3 to 4% unemployment level. I'm not sure I understand why that is considered full employment. I could just tell you that it is. Well, if the economy is robust, then you have what's known as a seller's market, because the employee, the potential employee, is going to sell his or her services to the highest bidder. And that may be regardless of many other criteria. A person may not want to relocate, but yet he or she receives an offer that's can't be refused, or he or she would be foolish to refuse. There may be some other factors that go in there as well. So we have to think about that. Now, on the flip side, if the economy is not doing as well, then that's a buyer's market, and the organization can be more picky, if you will. It's not the word, more choosy, it's a better word, if you will, in selecting a candidate for an open vacancy. Now, to go back to that buyer's market, I'd like to just relate a short story. I was attending, when I worked for a small nonprofit here in the area, I was attending a Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation meeting. And I was seated next to a gentleman who owned a small construction business, as I remember. And we were talking about, and this back in the late 1990s, and we were talking about employment and employees, et cetera. And he said he had an employee that called him on the phone and said, "I can't come into work today. I have a flat tire." And the guy said, "Well, fix your flat tire and come in as soon as you can." And the guy's response was, "Well, all 4 tires are flat." And I don't remember what the employer said to him. I, kind of was incredulous that the guy would have 4 flat tires. And so he said something else to him. And so the employee said, "Well, what are you going to do, Farmy?" Because the employee knew that he could find another job without any problem. Even though the employment was high, he was good because he had skills that people wanted. And then societal attitudes toward the industry, the institution, etc. People like the company, and the company is a good corporate citizen and supports social welfare programs and supports other type things, and gives back to the community, and is seen as a good steward of the environment and resources. And they probably have a pretty good chance of getting people. If they're not viewed that way, those companies, then there's going to be some issues. And as I mentioned before, much of this information can be contained, or can be obtained from the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor. Now, we also have some requirements, and availability comparison may reveal that the demand for employees is equal to the supply. Demand is less than the supply, or the demand is greater than supply. If demand, pardon me, and supply are equal, then no special recruiting efforts are needed or required. If demand is less than supply, the organization may consider employing the following tactics: restricting hiring, that is, replacing only the critical positions; reduced hours, which is another way of cutting costs; job sharing, not a long-term answer due to reduced employee earning power, but We have to remember that there are some people that want to be in the workforce that don't want full time for whatever reason, and job sharing is is a way that they can stay in the workforce and kind of do what they want to at the same time. When I was in the Army and stationed in St. Louis in the 1980s, we had job sharing for several programs in the office where I worked. And somebody would come in and work from uh, 8 to 12 or 12:30, and the other person would come in and work the remainder of the workday. Early retirements, of course, that appeals mostly to people in higher level positions, but it can be appealing to people in other positions as well. And then finally, layoffs. And I'm not advocating that. I'm just telling you what the possibilities are. If demand is greater than supply, you want to use the following tactics. Enlarge the recruiting area. That means if you normally recruit within your area of operations, which may be considered 25 miles or so radius, you may want to expand that to 50 or to 100. You might want to use increased radio advertising, regional newspapers. Now, a regional newspaper would probably be outside that 50-mile radius. I'll give you an example. Cincinnati is a fairly large city, and on its northern boundary, well, of course, beyond here, but north of here, about 50 some odd miles, is Dayton. So you may want to do the recruiting with if you're going to use newspapers, with the Dayton papers. And there's other areas as well that would have similar type situations. Change your compensation incentives to attract a different crowd. Increase training and development programs. Consider changing selection standards, but lowering standards. Now you have to be careful of this because that comes with its own problems. So, if you want to set the bar here, and now you have to, because the demand is greater than the supply, moving your bar here is going to give you some problems, and you need to understand that. Now, I'm not saying that, pardon me, that's a tactic that should not be used, but I think it's a tactic that you ought to think long and hard about doing. If you lower your selection standards, that almost always means that people coming in are going to require more training. And that is costly. It's costly even though it's budgeted, because you're taking people out of their normal job and having them conduct training. Now, yes, many human resource organizations, or departments, do have trainers, and they're available to do training, and they get paid to do that. They have to develop training, et cetera, and then put on the training program. Other type training is done as on-the-job training, where you have a seasoned employee training someone else to do something. One of the on-the-job training is a tried and true training method. Many companies do that. One of the issues with that, however, is as you're showing someone what to do, you're going to have increased scrap. Now, train the trainer also takes a qualified person out of his or her normal job to do this training program. So there's pluses and minuses to that. You just have to figure out what they are. But it's very difficult as far as I'm concerned. That doesn't make me right. But when you lower your standards, you're asking for trouble if you don't have a good contingency plan in place as to what you're going to do and how you're going to implement things that you need to implement based upon the lowered standards. Again, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't lower standards or that standards can't be lowered. What I'm suggesting is there are issues, and you have to address those issues up front before you get to the other piece. And if you have a plan, pardon me, you have a plan in place, then there should not be any difficulty. It's when you don't have a plan in place and you lower your standards. Maybe you have to. Maybe you don't have a choice in the matter. I would hope you do, but you may not have a choice in the matter. Then without, in the absence of a plan, you're going to have some problems. The next important piece to have in place before any recruiting activity takes place is a valid job analysis. The authors state that it is the collecting, analyzing, and interpreting the specifics of a job. Definition also mentions reporting. Now, that reporting was something that would go on to the job analysis form, and we've done this assessment, and this is what we have. So we're not talking about reporting in newspapers or something of that nature. In this context, reporting means that it's published in-house and it's maintained by the Human Resource Department as well as by the department in which the job is located. Furthermore, as the text points out, it is the most fundamental and important element of human resource management functions, because all other functions, not only within human resource management, but pretty much but throughout the organization, depend upon the accuracy of the job analysis. Now, it's very important. I can't overemphasize that. It is especially important to have a valid job analysis to assure compliance with federal regulations, especially when it comes to Americans with disabilities. We're going to talk about job analysis more extensively in Chapter 5, but I'm going to give some of this tonight, and then when I'm through with this section, we'll take a break. There are several elements within the job analysis that need explanation. And again, we're going to do this more fully in week 5. Job description, that is a principal product of the job analysis. A written summary of the job. The job specification outlines minimum qualifications such as skill, education, and experience. Job tasks, what duties the employee is expected to perform. Position spells out the employee's duties and responsibilities. Now, those duties and responsibilities can be in addition to the job, commensurate with the job, or complementary to the job. The tasks, I should say, and I did make that clear. The job analysis also may include things as a group of jobs with similar duties and responsibilities, and a job family. That is a group of 2 or more jobs that have similar duties and responsibilities. If an organization does not have written approved job analyses on file, it cannot complete its recruiting, selection, and staffing functions. That's just the bottom line. One of the things many potential employees will want to know is, what am I expected to do? Now, they may have a general idea of what the job entails, but since they don't know the specifics of your company, they're going to want to look at a job analysis, or they may want the job description and job specification, not so much the analysis itself. Job description and job specification are 2 major pieces of information, documents that come from the job analysis. It is appropriate to view a job analysis as a hub, and recruiting, selection, and staffing as its spokes. The job analysis helps drive and complete the other functions. And we have arrived at 5:13. I want to take a break now until 5:18, 5-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll complete the rest of tonight's recorded lecture. Please come back at 5:18. Thank you. All right, it's 5:18. We're back. So we're going to look at some of these other terms we've talked about tonight, or introduced earlier: recruiting, selecting, and staffing. Recruiting is the process of finding a sufficient quantity of individuals with the qualifications needed to fill an employment vacancy or perhaps employment vacancies. Many years ago, a line supervisor might stand outside the factory and point his finger to certain job seekers and tell them to come in and send the rest home. You might call that initial screening, but more likely these job seekers were selected on the basis of physical characteristics. We might still select based on physical characteristics, but not too often. In the recruiting process, we must attract and find the right applicants or start over what is a very costly process. Now, this particular slide I have up here from Stewart and Brown in their human resource management linking strategy to practice text kind of says the same thing that I just said. And of course, I got some of what I said from both Stewart and Brown and from the authors of your text, or our text, I should say. And what they're talking here about is a strategic approach as opposed to a shotgun approach. Now, in some cases, if companies need a lot of people to work, and people that they want to work don't have to have a lot of skills, and there's a lot of routine, mundane work in the job, they may use a shotgun approach and try to find as many people as possible, understanding that they're going to have a fairly high turnover rate. Fast food restaurants fall into that category. There's some other ones. But in a strategic approach, in other words, we set up what we want, and we've aligned our recruiting effort with the organization's mission, goals, and objectives. Then we're going to find applicants. I'm changing this just a little bit. We're going to find applicants of choice. And because we have, in a way, not only made a strategic approach to what we're doing here, we also have a targeted approach. We're going after certain types of individuals or a certain category of individuals. Then we become an employer of choice. And because we become an employer of choice, we can be very, very selective once we get past the recruiting process. Let me change that just a little bit. We can be more selective once we've gotten past the recruiting process. Now, what do I mean by this? We say we've been selective in the recruiting process. In other words, we're not going to do a shotgun approach. And so when we come in with, let's just use a notional number here of 10 people for an open vacancy, we can now we can be even more selective with those 10 people, because we know each of those 10 comes in with the requisite skills, knowledge, etc., and abilities that we kind of talked about, alluded to earlier in the course, and then we find throughout the text, KSAOs. We can be more selective here because we can choose the best of the best. And we already have the best because we've done this strategic approach. So we're doing that. So recruiting, as the authors state, is finding people with the right stuff, skills, experience, education, in sufficient numbers, and then urging them to apply or getting them to apply for vacancies. Now, sufficient numbers. I don't have this data in front of me, but a text I used many years ago said that you had to have a minimum of 6 qualified people for every vacancy. It may have changed today, but you certainly don't want to unless you're forced to choose between just two people. You want to have as many as possible to choose from. And one of the reasons is your first choice may decline for whatever reason. He or she may have gotten a different job offer. Or maybe they consider it to be better. And unfortunately, because it happens, they may be using you as a pawn to get someplace else. So you want to have more than just choosing between two. Now, it could come down after you've done your processes of choosing between two people, but you'd rather not start off with just two. The main purpose of recruiting is to have a large enough pool of qualified applicants from which to choose. It's kind of a repeat, but it says it somewhat differently. Ivancovich says that recruiting effort is the organization's first exposure to the prospective employee. Now, maybe we even want to say they're still an applicant at this phase. So it's critical that a good impression be made on these prospects. Now, we're going to go just a little bit past recruiting strategies, although I think it's good to look here. Broad skill scope or targeted scope, we talked about that just a little bit, and we'll talk more about that when we do the recruiting piece more in depth. And this just talks about what we're going to have here and how we're going to have it. I'm not going to go into that in great deal tonight, but we'll talk about this more in when we get to the recruiting piece. Figure 7.1 in the text presents a model recruiting process. Now remember that they do this. This is a model. This does not mean that every organization is going to follow the model, but this is a model that's been used. It's been tested. They believe it is an appropriate model to use, and so people would be well positioned to use this. Better off if they use it. So it talks here. I'm just going to look up. I have the text open. Human resource planning, whether it's a new position or existing position, fill internally, alternatives, feasible. That means overtime, temporaries, consultants, or something of that nature. And then the other things that you go through to get the person that you want or people that you want. But many alternatives to outside recruiting. Among them are screening for potential in-house candidates who possess the right skills, and of course the other things I mentioned, overtime, etc. And one thing I didn't mention, you could outsource to your not so much to a competitor, but to another organization. A lot of times, however, when you think about outsourcing some job functions or some jobs to a different organization, normally you're speaking about functions that the company does not feel is part of their core competency or is a core competency. And so they will outsource those functions to another organization. I don't think I mentioned this anyplace else in the course, and so I'll mention it here. A few years ago, Procter & Gamble, a Fortune 500 company, headquartered here in Cincinnati. By the way, I'm not choosing Procter & Gamble simply because it's a local company. This is an actual case, and I always felt it was an interesting case about outsourcing to pass along. Procter & Gamble decided that information technology for the company was not a core competency and not something that they felt good at doing. And so what they did was they outsourced their information technology and perhaps information management as well, departments to Hewlett Packard. Hewlett Packard is also a Fortune 500 company and also an American company. Now, what was good about this was it was a win-win for both companies. Procter & Gamble shed itself of functions that it did not feel fit their core competencies and for which they didn't have particular expertise. They signed a contract with Hewlett-Packard, and they shifted something they didn't think was a core competency to a company that was well versed in information technology and information management, worked as consultants for a number of companies, etc. And the third part of this, so Hewlett-Packard took on something that they were well positioned to do. And the third part of this win-win scenario is that all the employees that work for Procter & Gamble were hired by Hewlett-Packard and they stayed in place. They didn't move anywhere. Now, I can't address things like employee benefits, which be pension fund, etc. But there are laws in the books, federal laws, that people can transfer pensions over to a new company and pension benefits. And I don't know that whole scenario, but that can be done. There's all laws on the books that protect employees from that. There probably were some other compensation benefit issues in that whole contract scenario, of which I'm not aware. But it did not disadvantage the employees. Procter & Gamble shed itself of something for which it didn't feel like it had the competency to do, and Hewlett-Packard picked up something which it did, and obviously got new business. So 7.1 gives us the model recruiting process, and then we're going to look at some of the alternatives to a new hire and some of their advantages and disadvantages. Promoting from within can never be considered a disadvantage. Usually what happens here is that it's a win-win situation. The organization is promoting a person with, and they know this person's skills, ability, education, knowledge, etc. The only downside to that could possibly be where more than one internal candidate is applying for a job. Usually that's going to happen, and the person not selected is going to feel somewhat down in the dumps about it. So that could be a negative. But hiring from within is almost always a positive because it shows that the company pays attention to its employees and it gives its employees first refusal, if you will, about other things to do. Overtime can be good, but it can only be good for short periods. I say that because we have the 8-hour workday, and we have the 8-hour workday because research indicated that after 8 hours, an individual's ability declined. Now, that's not because the individual all of a sudden, after 8 hours on the job, or say 8.5 hours, it took a half an hour for lunch, his abilities just disappeared. No, what it means is that after a period of time, your ability diminishes because of length of time that you've been awake, length of time you've been on the job, job pressures, etc. So that's why I say overtime is only good for a short period of time. First job I had outside after I got out of college, and well, this was not, yeah, it was the first job, but it was still the first job after I got married. And I did one pay period, I had almost 20 hours overtime. And that money looked great, but boy, you know, I was away from home, and it just wasn't the best thing in the world. Now, it didn't cause me any animosity with my employer. I knew that was part of the game. Somebody left, and I was going to have to pick up some overtime. But you know, money isn't everything. Temporaries and contractors, you can do that. Temporaries do not work for you. They work for the agency that sent them to you. And although you do have some control over them, you don't have total control. Contractors have to be treated as contractors. They cannot be treated as employees. You can't make them do certain things unless it's within the signed contract. If you start treating them with like employees and they complain, the government's going to step in and they're going to probably come down on the side of the employee and say, you know, what you're doing is not right. You have to treat these people as employees. Uh, Microsoft got into some trouble about that a few years ago because it was treating its contractors as employees. They had to make some changes. Remember the temporaries and people look at the good side of temporaries and contractors. You don't pay benefits to those folks, but you no longer, you go back to this, you only exercise a certain amount of control. And there's just things that you can't make them do unless it's in the contract. Most entry-level jobs, as we've talked about and alluded to here, require outside recruiting. Can't get away from that because if it's an entry-level job, very seldom does a current employee want another entry-level job. Now, there are the occasions when an employee might ask for a transfer so he or she can gain additional skills. But that does not normally happen at the entry-level position. Depending upon the job, organizations find these potential employees in various locations. And we don't need to go through all that tonight, but certainly schools and job fairs and things of that nature come into play. And sometimes you'll find they'll get unsolicited inquiries, and often you find that there are retirees who are interested. And sometimes retirees want to get back in the workforce, and especially if it's a part-time job. They like to work, but they don't want to commit to 40 hours a week, so they might find that as well. There are many sources to use in reaching a target pool of applicants in a recruiting process. Of course, you know, there's advertising. That's newspapers. Can be done by radio and television, although probably not as often because those media tend to be expensive, especially television. Certainly you would have things like trade magazines and trade publications. I'm separating two. One might be a magazine, as I said. Other one might be a newspaper or a periodical or something of that nature. And then, of course, you have employment agencies, both private and government. For the most part, the government agencies will be referring people for entry-level positions. Occasionally, they will do some others, but most often, you'll find that a private employment agency, for the most part, are going to be people at the managerial level or salespersons or something of that nature, as opposed to entry-level. Not saying that you won't find entry-level. What I am saying is that for the most part, entry-level comes from the government agencies. And all of these recruiting tactics that I'm talking about, or agencies for use, are aimed at the external recruit, or aimed at, are integral to external recruitment. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but let me say that. Internal recruitment comes not only recruiting internally, that you know your assets from the Human Resource Management Information System, but also from employer referrals. We talked about employer referrals last week when I mentioned the Allen Bradley Corporation, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Of course, their issue was somewhat different, but for the most part, internal referrals are really good because the employee is not going to refer someone to the company for hire that he or she believes can't do the job. And if the person who is referred is selected, he or she is going to work doubly hard to make sure that they don't let the compatriot down. And so obviously that's going to extend on not letting the company down as well. Very few downsides to internal referrals. And then, of course, we have internal candidates that we mentioned before, and perhaps rehires. Sometimes people want to come back to the organization that they left, and as long as they left on good terms and there's no animosity built up, there's no good reason not to exclude these folks. Well, okay, after we've recruited a sufficient force, and again, we'll go over this in much greater detail when we do the recruiting assignment. After we recruited a sufficient pool of qualified candidates. Now, I want to home in on that. Qualified candidates. You don't want unqualified candidates. That's going to happen. We'll discuss that later, but we're talking now about qualified candidates. We don't want to talk about somebody just sent in an application just because. We're talking about qualified candidates. The selection process begins, and I want to be very clear here. Sometimes we tend to mix and match recruitment and selection. Once the company has received what it considers the right number of qualified applicants for the vacancy or vacancies that occur, the recruiting process stops. We are now into the selection process. And I point that out because in the past, students have tried to mix and match that. These are separate entities. Selection depends upon good recruiting. But once the pool of qualified applicants has been established and the recruiting process is stopped, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, the selection process begins, and one does not bleed over into the other. Now, I said I was going to come back to that in a second. The company has a pool of qualified candidates, but believes it needs more qualified candidates. It may reopen the recruiting process to attract more qualified candidates. But once they close that and say, now we have the number we need, the recruiting process has ended, and we are now into selection. We cannot mix those two together. You may be sitting here thinking, why is he beating on that? And the reason I am is because students tend to bleed those together, and they're separate and distinct. Selection depends upon good recruitment. But recruitment doesn't depend on good selection. Now, what recruitment does depend on selection is that they select the right candidate, so the recruiting process doesn't have to start over because we've selected not the right candidate, or we don't have what we want to have. So yes, they're complementary, but they're separate and distinct actions, and we have to treat them in that manner. We can't let one bleed over to the other. In this process, the Human Resource Management Department's personnel, along with the first-line supervisor or manager, will choose from the applicant pool what they believe to be the best of the best. Again, we're going to treat selection much more fully when we get to that part. But we have some steps that we go through here. We have a job interview. Well, we have an interview to determine the candidate's qualifications, even though we've established that they're at least minimally qualified. Now, before I talked about best qualified, so much forth, and that's all well and good. We want to make sure everybody who's in that selection pool is at least minimally qualified. Minimally qualified is they meet the requirements we set forth. Then we're going to go through some type of minor interview process to select the best of those who meet requirements and establish those as the qualified selection pool. This is a difficult process because unless specific job tests are used, selection can be selective. Maybe I shouldn't have used those two words together, but What I should have said is selecting the right candidate tends to be a selective judgment process. Folks involved at this stage need to be right because the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization is at risk if the wrong person is hired. 3 questions which I think you have seen in your text, or you should have seen in your text, about a potential candidate is, what can the applicant do? Well, let me change that. And when I said candidate and applicant, I mixed apples and oranges. Let's look at it this way. People are applicants until the pool of potential candidates has been selected. Once the pool of potential candidates has been selected, we consider these the best qualified, then we're going to ask not what the applicant can do. I think the text says it that way, but I prefer to say what the candidate can do, because we've gone through the process of doing some weeding out here, and now we're looking at people who are candidates for the position. And so I prefer to use it that way, because we should know from the applicant's application and resume, assuming that we ask for both, we should know some of this information. So now we're getting down to, we're cutting to the chase, if you will, and we're getting down to what the candidate can do. And does the candidate fit the organization's, or fit within the organization's mission, goals, objectives, and values? Again, not selecting the right candidate means we increase job turnover. And that's not something any company can afford. If we have a revolving door, we're increasing all kinds of costs, not just something that we can do. I mean, it's not something we can afford, not something that we can put up with. There's costs associated with recruiting. We'll talk about that. There's costs associated with selection. We'll talk about that as well. And, you know, employee salaries are part of that mix, but the things that are really important have to be discussed. At the most basic level, the selection process attempts to identify the person or persons with the greatest chance, or who have the greatest chance of meeting or exceeding the organization's performance standards for that particular job. That, however, does not mean quantity. It may refer to other criteria such as quality of output, reduced absenteeism, on-the-job satisfaction, and career potential. Therefore, it's important that the organization have what it considers the optimum match between the open vacancy and a particular characteristic the potential candidate possesses. In addition, based on the job analysis, the selection process focuses on minimum qualifications. Overqualified candidates is just as much of a problem as an underqualified candidate, and that person is just as likely to increase your turnover. Now, I think I have a slide that talks about that. Let me get that up here a second. No, I have that. Well, maybe we will. We'll think about that in a second. Figure 8.1 presents what the authors state as a model of the selecting process. Selecting is almost always accomplished via interview. We're going to spend a session talking about the interviewing and interviewing techniques. There may be different types of interviews, and the organization must determine which type to use based on the open positions. And we'll discuss the selection process more fully in week 5. This is just talking about people you want to try to find to get into the selection process. So we're not going to go there at this particular time. Staffing is the next and final item we're going to cover tonight. It is ensuring, staffing that is, that the organization has the right people in the right place, position, job, however you want it, whatever word you want to use there, to assure the organization can carry out its mission, goals, and objectives. I know you hear me say mission, goals, and objectives very often, and you might want to ask, or might be asking, why do I repeat that? Because it's very important. Everybody in an organization, and I'll probably repeat what I'm saying now again, I'm going to say now again, everybody in an organization, no matter what his or her position is, has to know what his or her job does and how it fits in and supports an organization's mission, goals, and objectives. If that person doesn't know that or doesn't understand that, or it's not been articulated to he or she, then you're going to have an employee who may not be a bad employee, but just doesn't understand what he or she's supposed to do and how it fits into the whole. And every position in an organization is important. Yes, some are more important than others. We would not equate the janitorial staff people's job with that of the CEO. They're different. It's not to denigrate the janitorial staff, but they're not thinking about the big picture. They're not thinking conceptually. They're thinking about doing their job and doing it well. And so, at least I hope they're thinking about doing it well. So we have to understand how each position, every employee should understand how his or her position fits in with the organization and fits in and supports the mission, goals, and objectives. This is the objective that staffing addresses. Now, staffing comes after we recruited people, and then after we have selected someone or someones to fill positions. So we have to get those folks that were into the right place. That's where staffing comes in. Note in the last paragraph on page 1 that the staffing objective is continual. This is critical for an organization's continuity. Staffing gaps may be acceptable in the short run, but never in the long run, as short staffing will eventually lead to a decline in employee morale. Now, let's look at a couple of Henneman's slides here. This is a staffing model that Henneman comes up with. Staffing quantity, that means how many we need. He says levels here, how many do you need? Well, then we get to quality. And we have two things there which we talk about, we'll talk about more. And the first is the match between the person and the job. So we're looking to fill a position using the person job fit or person job match. Person has the right skills, knowledge, abilities, etc., that the job requires. Another aspect of quality is the person-organization match. Does the person and the organization fit? Here we're talking about is the person in sync with the organization's vision and its values and its culture. For instance, Toyota Motor Corporation of America, if it has people come in to apply for jobs as managers, they take these potential candidates on a 2 or 3 day retreat and go through a process of finding out if there's a values fit and even a cultural fit. Now, please don't think here we're talking about fitting an American culture in with the Japanese culture. No, it's the culture, the work culture that's been developed within that organization. Yeah, it's probably a little bit more based on the Japanese style, but their management style tends to be a little bit different than American style. But there's still some workplace culture, workplace values, and that's what we're talking about here in this particular situation. Now, here's another information about staffing. Uh, Notice what it says here. Staffing is process of acquiring, deploying, retaining. Deploying simply means putting a person in the right place. And retaining a workforce. Retention, we've not talked a lot about. We'll talk about retention later in the course, but that's very important. I've said before, a company doesn't need a revolving door. Employee comes in today, goes out 6 weeks, 6 months later. Companies don't need that. Notice that, and quality to create a positive environment. Very, very important, because that tells us how well a company can do its job, how effective it can be. And then the implications of the definition. Is staffing a process or is it a system? A process, to me, in a way, tells us that we're going through motions. A system can tell us the same way. So what are we adding to me here, are we adding some people element into this? We have a system set up to take care of staffing. Maybe our HRIS system will do that. But are we going through the right process to do that? Is there, to me, this means is there a human element in what we're doing? Obviously, quality and quantity issues, we have to have enough people to do the job. But along with that quantity comes quality. And we have to have enough people to do the job, but they have to have the right skills to do the job correctly, to be both effective and efficient. That's the quality piece. And I would submit to you that if we don't have quality employees, we're probably going to have difficulty. I like this slide because of what it says. And there are several things you can take off of this slide. But I like the second thing from Richard Fairbank, Chief Executive. I'm assuming this means Chief Executive. And we normally see Chief Executive Officer. Notice what he says, that people spend, or managers spend 2% of their time going through the recruiting and selecting process, or especially the selecting process, and 75% of the time trying to figure out how they made mistakes. I think that's very interesting. And you know, each of these things we're talking about tonight meld together, mesh together, are integral at each other, etc. But you know, recruiting the wrong people. Stop and think about this. Recruiting the wrong people means we're going to select the wrong people. Means we're going to staff the wrong people. Now, I'm not saying that recruiting is more important than selecting and staffing. What I am saying, however, is that the others depend upon correct recruiting. Getting the right people to apply for vacancies. And then here are some staffing system examples. Gore staffs, William W. Gore, W.L. Gore, that's a Gore-Tex, gloves, etc. They staff without job titles. I've seen that before. I think it's a very interesting concept. And I can't explain how that's done, but I think it's a very interesting concept. Rent-A-Car relies on internal assets to fill vacancies. And notice performance evaluation is used for placement. Now, we're going to talk about performance evaluation, but the key I want to talk about here about performance evaluation is that performance evaluation must be based on standards. And then there should be a piece in a performance evaluation that is evaluating the person's potential to take the next higher position or to be promoted, maybe a better way to say that. Notice there the last part about Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. They hire people who are adaptable to change. And so when they go through their, not so much their recruiting process, although they might be part of it, but the selecting process, they'll have something targeted, either an interview or some maybe a stress test or something. Now, stress test, I don't think about somebody going on a treadmill and being strapped with electrodes. A stress test of what's coming in, how they're going to handle this. Probably what they're saying here is they're looking for executives or at least managers who are able to change quickly. And so when Pfizer is recruiting and eventually selecting, they're going to target something or some area, or they're going to have a targeted scope for their recruiting that looks for people who can do this. I think that's also relatively interesting. Now we got a few more slides with Henneman. I'm just going to scroll down here, but I'll take this down until we get to them. I think it'll be interesting to talk about. Sometimes this action is coupled with recruitment and selection, and it almost has to be. It especially has to be coupled with selection. At other times, it is placing current employees in positions better suited to their abilities and capabilities. Regardless of how this human resource management task is performed, it is always preceded by working from or with a job analysis. So back to something I talked about early on, which we're going to discuss fully in week 5. As with the previous 2 tasks, getting this right saves the organization time and money. It's very critical. Figure 1.2 on page 9 depicts the staffing system. It lists, I'll just open this up and we'll look at it here for a second. And you can see there what it does and how it's set up. The components of staffing. And notice it has job analysis and design, human resource planning, recruiting, selecting, etc. And then the implementers down here at the bottom. It lists the tasks and activities performed by those charged with implementing and managing an organization's staffing system and processes. The ultimate goal, as you can see, is to secure, motivate, and retain the right employees in the quantity and quality needed to perform the work of the organization and help it achieve its stated mission, goals, and objectives. Now let's look at what we have here from Henneman. Staffing strategy. We're kind of at the end of the amount of time we're going to spend tonight, but we're now back at asking a definition. Notice it says requiring key decisions about acquisition, deployment, and retention of a company's workforce. Requires key decisions. We did talk about this early on, but now we're back saying that's what the definition requires of us. So we need to understand what staffing is all about. Henneman says that it involves 13 key decisions in 2 different areas: levels and quality. So here are staffing levels. You notice staffing here, at least to me, is talking about quantity. We're talking about getting the right talent and then developing it, making it better than what it was. Hire and retain, hire or retain. I think it can be that way, but I think that's together. I think you hire and retain. That should be your objective. If you hire an employee or a person to become an employee, and he or she passes your litmus test, then you ought to do everything possible to retain that employee. It's just too expensive to see that employee go out the door. You track, you relocate. You have a short-term focus or a long-term focus. You understaff or overstaff. Problems with overstaffing. Overstaffing gets into budgetary issues that we're not going to talk about too much here. We'll talk a little bit about them on recruiting and selecting about cost, but we're not into budget. And so you don't want to think about overstaffing. Now, there may be a time if you have a huge production run or a critical production run or something of that nature that you may want to overstaff on a short-term basis. But overstaffing on a long-term basis is counterproductive. At least that's what Reed says, because you're going to have eventually going to have people standing around. Quality. We talk about person and organization fit, person and job fit. We have to have the requisite. Each employee has to have the requisite KSAOs: knowledge, skills, abilities, and other. That's not negotiable. When we accept something less than that, that's what we're going to have problems. Do you want, notice this next one. I think this is very good. Do you want an acceptable workforce? In other words, a workforce that meets the published standards of the organization, or do you want an exceptional workforce? Are you willing to have acceptable some places and demand exceptional other places? That's also a possibility. I don't think it's a good strategy, but it is a possibility. I like this last one, and we talked about this, and each of you were pretty passionate in your responses to the Abercrombie and Fitch case. Do we want active diversity or do we want passive diversity? We have passive diversity. If we settle for that, it misses the mark. Now, I'm not talking about numbers. I'm just saying it misses the mark. We're not doing what we don't do. If we don't cast in our recruiting effort a wide enough net to attract the best and the brightest with the qualifications needed, we're missing the boat. And so we need to be aggressive in that area. We also need to be aggressive in that area because we want our workforce to match or to mirror the demographics of the area of our operations. And so if our area of operations has 30% minorities, that's what we ought to have. And same thing goes for women. There's a very good, we don't work it in this course, but a very good case that I use in a different course about Xerox. And Xerox, in response to the riots that we had in the 1960s, actually went on an active recruiting campaign to bring minorities into the workforce. And after a while, Xerox found out that it was very successful at attracting minorities to their workforce and attracting minorities with the talent they needed. but it was very unsuccessful retaining minorities. And minorities didn't see chances for promotion, for instance, so they didn't feel like the chances for promotion. They didn't feel like that was inclusive. And so actually what Xerox did is it went back to scratch and developed a program to not only continue to attract minorities, but to retain minorities by having sufficient tools, I suppose is the best way to say, and of course then making sure there was equal opportunity for promotion and training, development, et cetera, et cetera. And so that today, approximately 50% of managerial positions at Xerox are staffed with minorities. And 48 some odd percent of management positions are held by women or people of color or both. So they've been very successful. And then one other piece about Xerox is that Xerox is the first company in the United States that had a woman chief executive officer who was succeeded by another woman as chief executive officer. So that's what this is talking about, this active or passive type thing, or at least that's the story I related here about Xerox and what its approach was, or what its approach is. It gives you some idea of what they were doing. Well, that brings me to the end of what I want to cover for this evening. We're a little earlier than normal. Next week, we are going to spend some time on legal issues and some court cases that have been decided by the United States Supreme Court, and perhaps in a case or two have been decided by federal appeals court that have lasting ramifications on the workforce. The case that I will spend most of the time speaking about is the Griggs case. It is listed in your text, and I suggest that you read it. As you do know, or at least I hope you know, the assignment for week 3 is to select a significant piece of federal legislation or significant court decision, preferably a Supreme Court decision, although that's not set in stone, that has effect on how companies recruit, hire, and select. So I thank you for the last hour, 45 minutes or so, and I will have the lecture uploaded tomorrow to week 2 in the on campus web and the course, and also should have be able to pass along to you access to get the recorded lecture from YouTube. So again, I thank you for your attention and good night.